Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 17A, and today we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, and specifically how Andrew Jackson is seen as an odd symbol of democracy. Now, the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828 ushered in a new era in U.S. history, one in which property qualifications for voting disappeared and the nation truly became democratic. Yet, Jackson was an odd symbol of democratic reform. He was not himself a common man, and many of the policies he championed would not be considered democratic today. Now, this lecture's careful examination of the age of Jackson reveals much about the nature of American democracy, both in his time and today. Now, Andrew Jackson was born into poverty on the Carolina frontier in 1767. By the age of 14, he was an orphan. He moved west and he prospered, becoming a slave-holding planter and a major political figure in the new state of Tennessee. During the War of 1812, Hamilton became a national military hero for his victories at the battles of Horseshoe Bend and New Orleans. He also achieved fame for his invasion and conquest of Spanish Florida, which eventually led to the acquisition of Florida. Throughout these years, he prospered economically, made a fortune, lost it, made another. In doing so, he became a symbol of the common man, as well as a symbol of his era and its values. He stopped many army desertions in the War of 1812, and managed to defeat the British Army, the finest in the world, at New Orleans, with a ragtag force of farmers, pirates, Indians, and others. He ignored diplomatic protocol and international law by invading Spanish Florida in pursuit of hostile Indians and escaped slaves who had crossed the border. In the process, he took 2 Spanish forts, executed 2 British subjects, deposed the Spanish governor of Pensacola, seized the Spanish archives, and appointed his own governor. He defeated a superb marksman in a duel in 1806, pretending he was unharmed even though a bullet had lodged in his chest, then hitting his opponent with a mortal shot. The fact that Jackson's success was tempered by personal tragedy only enhanced his appeal as a man of the people. His beloved wife, Rachel, died just a few months before his presidential inauguration. Jackson emerged as a major political figure with his 1823 election to the Senate and the 1824 presidential election, which took place during the so-called era of good feelings, when the Federalist Party had disappeared and left only one national party, the Democratic Republicans. In 1824, however, his party split over its presidential candidate, and 4 candidates ultimately emerged for the race: Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, and Jackson. Now, Adams was the son of the former president and a brilliant diplomat. As Secretary of State under Monroe, he was responsible for the acquisition of Florida and the Monroe Doctrine. Clay, known as Harry of the West, was a former Speaker of the House and a war hawk, a peace negotiator at Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, and a popular voice of the New West. Calhoun was another former war hawk and nationalist, but one who would soon move in the opposition direction to defend slavery in the South. He had a reputation for having a sharp mind, but he dropped out of the race early to run for the vice presidential position, which he won. Jackson ran as a war hero, an alternative to Clay as the voice of the New West. Now, Jackson won a plurality of both the popular and the electoral vote, but no majority. Thus, the election went to the House of Representatives, where each state casts 1 vote. The contest came down to Jackson and Adams. Adams won with Clay's support, then appointed Clay Secretary of State. Outrage against this corrupt bargain poisoned Adams' presidency and ensured Jackson's victory in the 1828 election. Many historians agree that democracy made Jackson rather than vice versa. Indeed, no one really knew what Jackson stood for in 1829, but as president, he would dominate events and help to define the main political characteristics of this new democracy that had elected him. Key events of Jackson's presidency included Indian removal, the Maysville Road veto, the nullification crisis, and the destruction of the Second National Bank. In the 1830s, Jackson refused to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court that the Cherokee Nation was entitled to federal protection from Georgia state actions to force its removal. Instead, he used federal troops to impel the movement of the Cherokees out of Georgia, resulting in the notorious Trail of Tears. In the Maysville Road event, Jackson vetoed a bill that would have authorized federal funds for internal improvements, insisting this was a state issue and that the bill overstepped the powers granted to Congress. Now, although Jackson supported slavery and thus the gag rule against abolitionists, he was an intense nationalist who would not tolerate South Carolina's attempt to nullify a new tariff law. Jackson also destroyed the Second Bank of the United States through his veto of its new charter and removal of federal funds before the old charter expired, moving those funds into state pet banks. During these and other events, Jackson transformed the office of president in the name of the people. He made massive use of the presidential veto, expanded executive power at the expense of Congress, refused to enforce Supreme Court decisions with which he disagreed, and became known to his enemies as King Andrew. Now, Jackson justified the expansion of presidential power on the grounds that he was the only government official elected by all the people, and that his new power was needed to tear down special privilege that had come to dominate Washington. Now, Jackson instituted rotation in office and the spoils system for federal appointees, a move he justified as a democratic attack on the entrenched aristocracy of educated bureaucrats. He also instituted the kitchen cabinet of special personal advisors not subject to Senate confirmation, justifying it as a move away from the elitism of the cabinet and necessary given the presence of political appointees in that body whom he did not trust. Now, Jackson justified all these moves in the name of democracy, but today it's clear that many were not democratic and that they resulted in corruption of the American political system, a dangerous expansion and abuse of executive power, a crippling of the American financial system, and a gross denial of rights for opponents of slavery and for Indians. Interestingly, many of Jackson's revolutionary moves were also justified via the old Jeffersonian doctrine of limited government and states' rights. The Jacksonian coalition was made up of many contradictory elements that had little in common other than the desire for change. The lowest common denominator able to hold this coalition together was a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The contradictions in Jacksonian democracy are best illustrated through analysis of the so-called Bank War. Chartered in 1816 for 20 years, the Second Bank of the United States stood as a symbol of the Democratic-Republican Party's move to political center after the Jeffersonian opposition to the First National Bank. Control of the bank was divided 20-80 between the government and the private sector. The bank served many useful functions, both for the government and for the American financial and economic system, but also had many enemies. It was distrusted by small farmers and Eastern workers, and opposed by businessmen, Western bankers, Wall Street financiers, Southern slaveholders, and Jeffersonian Republicans. The lowest common denominator among these opponents, which Jackson used to justify his veto of the Bank Recharter Bill in 1832, was strict interpretation of the Constitution to destroy special privilege. But this is also an argument against any government control of the economy and a validation of Adam Smith's economic ideology of laissez-faire. Jackson followed up on his veto after his 1832 re-election with a personal vendetta to destroy the bank. despite the fact that its charter still had 3 years to run. To carry out the destruction of the bank, he had to fire 2 Treasury secretaries, both of whom feared financial and economic disaster if the bank was shut down, before he found a third who was willing to assist him in removing government deposits from the bank. Disaster did indeed follow. Jackson placed federal funds in state pet banks, which then used the funds to underwrite more paper money, leading to a vicious cycle of over-speculation in land and inflation. Now, Jackson tried to stop the speculation with his specie circular in 1836, announcing that henceforth the government would accept only gold and silver for land. The land market collapsed, and overextended banks called in their loans, which led to panic and depression in 1837 under Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. Now, Jackson is an apt symbol for a democratic era in which all free white males obtained the right to vote, and for an ideological revolution in economics as laissez-faire triumphed over government direction of economic growth. The two were now fused in American ideology by the concept of equality of opportunity, and thus no special